Behind the polished portraits and ceremonial speeches, there are shadows no spotlight dares to reach. These are not just stories of power, but of what power hides, moments exchanged in silence, letters burned, truths denied for generations. The presidency is built on the image of control, but desire doesn't follow protocol. This is the hidden history they never taught, where the personal was buried deeper than state's secret sand. The truth waited, patient, in the margins. Thomas Jefferson. In the stillness of Monticello's long corridors, the sound of footsteps might have carried through the house differently at night. The hush that followed was not the silence of peace, but the silence of secrecy. Thomas Jefferson, third President of the United States, lived much of his life beneath a dual identity, one that spoke eloquently about liberty, reason, and natural rights, and another that existed in the shadows, among the enslaved, where history lingered long before it spoke. Jefferson's relationship with Sally Hemings has become one of the most widely examined and debated aspects of his private life. For many years, it was treated as rumor, speculation, or politically motivated attack. But the core of the mystery was not in whether something happened, it was in why so little of it was ever allowed to surface. The details, when pulled from letters, birth records, and DNA analysis, formed a picture that the public eye had been shielded from for nearly 2 centuries. Sally Hemings was born in 1773, the daughter of Elizabeth Hemings, an enslaved woman, and John Wales, who was also Jefferson's father-in-law. That made Sally Hemings the half-sister of Jefferson's wife, Martha. After Martha's death in 1782, Jefferson never remarried. But by the time he was in Paris as minister to France in the mid-1780s, something more private had begun to form, one that would follow him back across the Atlantic and remain veiled in silence for decades. In 1787, a 14-year-old Sally Hemings accompanied Jefferson's daughter to Paris. While in France, Hemings was legally free due to French laws regarding slavery, but historical accounts suggest that she returned to Virginia with Jefferson voluntarily after negotiating certain terms. According to her son Madison Hemings, those terms included extraordinary privileges for Sally and the promise that her children would be freed when they came of age. These arrangements, though privately struck, would shape the rest of their lives. The claims that Jefferson fathered children with Hemings were first publicly raised in 1802 by journalist James T. Callender, who had once been an ally and then turned critic. His allegations were met with both outrage and dismissal at the time, dismissed as political slander during a particularly hostile period. Jefferson himself never publicly addressed the accusations. But over the years, the pattern of births, the records from Monticello, and the observations of others both enslaved and free began to trace a quiet line through the mystery. The evidence eventually gathered not just in anecdotes, but in data. In 1998, a Y chromosome DNA study compared the male line descendants of Jefferson's uncle to those of Eston Hemings, Sally's youngest son. The results showed a genetic match. While the DNA could not prove a relationship between Jefferson and Sally Hemings directly, it did confirm that a Jefferson male fathered Eston. The historical context, combined with Jefferson's location and the records at Monticello, led most historians to agree. Thomas Jefferson was almost certainly the father of at least one, and likely all 6 of Hemings' known children. But the deeper question remains, why was this story hidden for so long? Some of it had to do with how Jefferson was remembered. As the author of the Declaration of Independence, he was mythologized as a man of vision and virtue. His personal contradictions between the ideals of liberty and the realities of slave ownership were often set aside in the telling of the nation's founding. And amid that, the relationship with Hemings was treated as a threat to that image. It disrupted the narrative. It asked the wrong questions. The narrative surrounding Hemings was shaped by the silence of her voice in the historical record. She never left behind letters or personal writings, and most of what we know comes through the accounts of her children and the descendants of those who lived at Monticello. Madison Hemings's 1,873 memoir provided one of the most detailed personal accounts of the relationship, describing Jefferson not just as an owner, but as a father who made commitments, fulfilled promises, and lived a double life in full awareness of what it cost. Despite that, the descendants of Jefferson and Hemings remained marginalized in historical discourse for decades. Their stories were not part of official tours. They were not represented in public memory until well into the 21st century. Only in recent years did Monticello incorporate the Hemings narrative into its exhibitions, acknowledging a fuller, more complex picture of Jefferson's life, one in which privacy did not mean denial, and intimacy was never simple. There's an element of the Jefferson-Hemings story that resists easy categorization. To frame it purely as a romance is to overlook the structures of power and consent that define their context. To view it only as exploitation is to ignore the long, complicated familial relationships that followed. Jefferson freed all of Hemings' children, either during his lifetime or through his will. Sally Hemings herself was unofficially freed after his death and lived her final years with her sons in Charlottesville. Still, the secrecy endured. Jefferson's white descendants denied the relationship for generations, often suggesting alternative explanations or flatly rejecting the DNA findings when they emerged. The refusal to acknowledge Hemings' descendants as legitimate members of the Jefferson lineage continued even as the scientific and historical consensus shifted. Reunions of Jefferson family members, for a time, excluded those descending from Hemings. What remains unsettling is not just the nature of the relationship, but the machinery of forgetting that kept it invisible. For over 100 years, the presence of Hemings and her children was edited out of the Founding Fathers' narrative, not because the evidence was unavailable, but because the implications were uncomfortable. It's a silence that raises questions not only about Jefferson, but about how history is told, who tells it, and why. The quiet weight of that story still hangs in the rooms of Monticello, in the private quarters, in the narrow stairwells, in the journals that make no mention of names that should have mattered. It was not just a hidden affair, it was a parallel family, a life divided between daylight and dusk, preserved only in fragments. The mystery does not lie in whether it happened, but in how the truth managed to stay submerged for so long, carried forward not in the voices of presidents or politicians, but in the quiet persistence of descendants who kept their history alive when no one else would. And while Thomas Jefferson's story ends in the quiet hills of Virginia, another hidden life was unfolding in a different era. In the office of a man who once wrote love letters in hotel rooms under assumed names, another president whose secrets would wait nearly a century to surface, this time in the pages of a forgotten book and the results of a DNA test that would speak louder than any campaign promise. Warren G. Harding. The letters were sealed for decades, packets of aging paper wrapped in silence, and bound by the request of a man who once held the highest office in the land. When they were finally unsealed in 2014, the contents were not diplomatic dispatches or national secrets. They were intimate, yearning, at times startlingly candid. They were love letters written by Warren G. Harding, the 29th President of the United States, to a woman who was not his wife. Carrie Fulton Phillips was the wife of one of Harding's close friends. Their affair began in the early 1900s, when Harding was still a newspaper publisher and state senator in Ohio. For years, it was a secret held tightly between them, shared only through whispered meetings and handwritten pages. The affair continued well into his time as a U.S. senator, and by the time Harding ran for president in 1920, the risk of exposure had grown not just personally, but politically. There was another complication. Carrie Fulton Phillips had pro-German sympathies during World War I, a view that clashed with Harding's political positioning. She reportedly threatened to reveal the affair and their correspondence if he voted for America's entry into the war. To manage the situation, Republican Party officials intervened. It is believed that the Republican National Committee paid Phillips to remain silent and travel abroad during the 1920 campaign. These details remained largely speculative until decades later, when the letters themselves were made public. In those letters, Harding signed off with code names, referring to himself as Jerry and to Phillips as Powderson, or simply Carrie. The tone of the letters was deeply personal, sometimes poetic, sometimes painfully earnest. They spoke of longing, of physical desire, of shared memory. They also reflected a level of emotional dependency not often associated with public figures of Harding's stature. And yet, they were not part of the public narrative during his lifetime. Harding's presidency, which began with a landslide victory and a promise of a return to normalcy, was soon overshadowed by scandals, most notably the Teapot Dome scandal, which involved corrupt leasing of federal oil reserves. But while Teapot Dome became a symbol of political corruption, Harding's personal secrets remained buried deeper. Only after his death in 1923 did some of those secrets begin to surface. One of them came from a woman named Nan Britton. Britton was 30 years younger than Harding and claimed to have had a relationship with him that began when she was still a teenager. After Harding's death, she published a book titled The President's Daughter in 1927, alleging that Harding had fathered her child, Elizabeth Ann. The book was met with public skepticism, media backlash, and legal challenges. Britton was ridiculed, and her claims were largely dismissed as opportunistic. There were no love letters between Harding and Britton to bolster her story. There were no political allies willing to vouch for her. For most of the 20th century, her story remained outside the historical mainstream, and yet, Britton never wavered in her claim. Her daughter, Elizabeth Ann, grew up with the knowledge that her father had once been president, but no public recognition to affirm it. It wasn't until 2015, nearly a century after Elizabeth Ann's birth, that DNA evidence provided confirmation. Through modern genetic testing, conducted by Ancestry DNA in cooperation with historians, it was revealed that Harding was indeed her biological father. The result reframed not just Britton's story, but Harding's legacy, an acknowledgement of a personal truth that had waited decades for verification. The implications of these revelations extend beyond Harding himself. They offer a lens into the ways secrecy was enforced and sustained not just through personal discretion, but through institutional complicity. The suppression of the Britton story was not merely about protecting a reputation. It was about maintaining a carefully constructed image of the presidency. In an era before 24-hour news cycles and digital transparency, it was still possible to manage public perception with a tight circle and a locked archive. What's striking is that both affairs, Phillips and Britton, were separated not just by years, but by tone. With Carrie Fulton Phillips, Harding appeared vulnerable, emotional, perhaps even overwhelmed by his own longing. With Nan Britton, the relationship was cloaked in youth, imbalance, and a public denial that endured for decades. These two women occupied very different spaces in Harding's life, yet both were consigned to the margins of his historical identity until the evidence demanded their inclusion. There is no record of how Florence Harding, the president's wife, responded to either relationship. Some accounts suggest she was aware of her husband's infidelities. Others imply she maintained silence as a form of control. Florence was fiercely protective of Harding's image and role, often referred to as his closest political advisor. Whether she accepted or resented his behavior remains an open question, but she outlived him by less than 2 years and gave few interviews after his death. Harding's presidency was brief, just over 2 years, and his sudden death in 1923 left many questions unanswered. Some conspiracy theories even emerged around the circumstances of his death, but none were substantiated. What is clear is that his personal life remained one of the most obscured aspects of his legacy for much of the 20th century. It was only through the slow drip of unsealed documents and advancing science that the fuller picture began to emerge. Even today, Harding is often remembered more for what went wrong in his administration than for who he was in private. But the letters, the DNA results, and the voices of descendants have reinserted human complexity into a figure long reduced to scandal headlines. The nature of these affairs, their secrecy, and their delayed revelation all speak to a deeper dynamic, the distance between personal truth and public image. There is something fundamentally quiet about the way these stories returned. No grand confessions, no breaking news spectacles. Just archival releases, family memories, and scientific results folding into each other until the story could no longer be ignored. It's a reminder that some truths take longer to surface, not because they are hidden well, but because no one wanted to look too closely. Warren G. Harding is no longer simply a footnote in presidential history. His private life, long protected by gatekeepers and disbelief, now forms part of a larger narrative about secrecy, memory, and the lives that intersected with the presidency without ever being acknowledged by it. And in that, he is not alone. Because, while one president's secrets were revealed through DNA and rediscovered letters, another president born of wealth, raised in expectation, would carry his secrets behind closed doors in Hyde Park, sharing glances and silences with a woman who wasn't his wife, a woman who would be there when he took his last breath, even as the country remained unaware she had been there at all. Franklin D. Roosevelt. The final moments of Franklin D. Roosevelt's life did not take place in the White House, but in a quiet cottage in Warm Springs, Georgia. It was the 12th of April, 1945. He was seated for a portrait. The war in Europe was entering its final phase. The president, weakened by years of physical strain and private illness, was still at the helm of a nation fractured by crisis and war. And as he collapsed, stricken by a cerebral hemorrhage, the woman by his side was not his wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, but Lucy Mercer Rutherford. Their relationship had begun decades earlier, before Roosevelt was president, before he was a national figure, and before anyone outside Washington's close social circles would have whispered her name in the same breath as his. Lucy Mercer was hired as Eleanor Roosevelt's social secretary in 1914. She was bright, elegant, and came from a distinguished Catholic family. Within a few years, she and Franklin had grown close, closer than propriety or Eleanor would have tolerated. The affair came to light in 1918, when Eleanor discovered a packet of love letters while unpacking Franklin's luggage. It was a private implosion. The Roosevelts were already strained by years of political life and personal differences. But this discovery marked a turning point. Eleanor offered him a choice: end the affair or face separation. Divorce was considered, but Franklin's mother, Sarah Delano Roosevelt, reportedly threatened to cut off his financial support if he left Eleanor. The threat was not minor. Sarah controlled much of the family's wealth. The pressure worked. Franklin ended the affair, at least officially. From the outside, their marriage endured. But privately, the emotional intimacy between Franklin and Eleanor never fully recovered. They maintained a public partnership, a shared political life, and a kind of mutual respect. Eleanor would go on to become a formidable public figure in her own right, an advocate, a writer, a speaker. But their relationship was often described as a political alliance more than a conventional marriage. Despite ending the romantic relationship, Franklin and Lucy Mercer Rutherford remained connected. She eventually married wealthy widower Winthrop Rutherford in 1920, seemingly closing that chapter of her life. Yet, over the years, their paths continued to intersect. Letters were exchanged discreetly. Arrangements were made for brief visits. Roosevelt's aides and confidantes, including his daughter Anna, became intermediaries. Eleanor knew of the contact, but the full extent was obscured. By the time Roosevelt was elected to the presidency in 1932, Lucy Rutherford was no longer a controversial figure. She was almost invisible in the public sphere. The press never connected her name to the president in any scandalous context. There were no headlines, no rumors that reached the public's ear. The affair had been buried under layers of discretion, privilege, and time. Yet behind the walls of Warm Springs, it was Lucy who had returned not just as a friend or acquaintance, but as someone with a lasting, unspoken claim to the president's inner life. She had been invited quietly. She had arrived days earlier, and she was with him when his life came to a sudden, silent end. Her presence was not mentioned in initial reports. When the news broke that the president had died, the public saw only the surface, a a president passing away at a retreat he had built for polio rehabilitation, surrounded by aides and doctors. It was only later, through careful documentation and memoirs, that the full story emerged. Lucy Rutherford had been there. She left before Eleanor arrived. No confrontation took place. No questions were asked. The secrecy surrounding Lucy's presence at Warm Springs reflected a broader pattern. Throughout Roosevelt's presidency, details of his private life were closely guarded. The press cooperated with an unspoken rule not to photograph him in his wheelchair. His declining health in his final years was minimized or denied outright. The machinery of perception was powerful, and it worked overtime to protect the image of strength, vigor, and authority. Roosevelt's aides, especially those closest to him, played key roles in preserving that image. His daughter Anna, who lived in the White House and often acted as a liaison between her parents, helped facilitate meetings between Roosevelt and Lucy in his later years. Some historians have suggested she did so out of compassion, believing her father deserved comfort in his final chapter. Others see it as a quiet rebellion against a marriage that had long since lost its intimacy. The complexity of Roosevelt's personal life never truly intersected with his political downfall, because he had none. He was elected to an unprecedented 4 terms in office. His leadership during the Great Depression and World War II defined a generation. And yet, behind that monumental legacy, there was an emotional undercurrent few ever saw. The love he carried, the decisions he made, and the silences he kept all existed beneath the surface of the public Roosevelt. Lucy Mercer never publicly spoke of the affair. She remained private, guarded, and loyal to the memory of the man she had loved for so long. She died in 1948, just 3 years after Roosevelt. Her personal correspondence with him, though limited in quantity, painted a picture of enduring affection, one marked by separation, restraint, and mutual understanding. Eleanor Roosevelt, for her part, never forgave the betrayal. While she remained a tireless advocate and public servant, she rarely spoke of Lucy by name. Her writings hinted at emotional pain but did not dwell on the affair itself. What she built after the revelation in 1918 was a life of independence, a separate identity shaped not by her husband's needs, but by her own convictions. The story of Franklin D. Roosevelt and Lucy Mercer is not one of scandal in the traditional sense. It did not unfold through public disgrace or political fallout. Instead, it moved in the background, shaped by private choices, cultural norms, and a network of people willing to guard the president's secrets. It was hidden not through denial, but through omission, a kind of quiet agreement among those who knew better than to speak. But time, as always, has its way of lifting curtains. The revelations about Lucy's role in Roosevelt's life added depth to his biography not by tarnishing it, but by humanizing it. The image of a president who found emotional refuge outside his marriage challenges simple narratives. It invites questions about the burdens of leadership, the loneliness of public life, and the ways in which love and duty rarely align neatly. What endures is not the affair itself, but its resonance. A leader facing the weight of global conflict, a nation watching for signs of strength, and a quiet moment shared in a Georgia cottage that history almost forgot. The intersection of the personal and the historical was brief, unacknowledged in the moment, and nearly lost to time. But from that moment, one of death, of silence, of presence, another thread begins. Because not long after Roosevelt passed, the command of American forces fell to a man who had served under him in war. A general turned president, known for his discipline, his leadership, and his tightly controlled image. But beneath the medals and command, he too would carry a relationship that refused to stay buried, a story that began in war and followed him home. Dwight D. Eisenhower. The war had a way of folding time. In London, amid blackouts and briefing rooms, medals and maps, everything moved at a pace that left no room for hesitation and no space for normal life. Dwight D. Eisenhower, then Supreme Allied Commander, carried the burden of orchestrating one of the most ambitious military operations in history. He was precise, commanding, and publicly restrained. But behind the operational calm of day and the march across Europe, another narrative was unfolding quietly, a relationship that would remain cloaked in ambiguity long after the last shot was fired. Kay Summersby was a British military driver assigned to Eisenhower's staff in 1942. Irish-born and formerly a model, Summersby was competent, attentive, and unfailingly discreet. Her proximity to Eisenhower quickly evolved from professional to personal. She became his constant companion, driving him across wartime Britain, accompanying him to meetings, and serving as his aide during critical periods of the Allied campaign. In official photographs, she was almost always nearby. What was left unstated in the captions spoke volumes in retrospect. Their closeness did not escape notice. Members of the military staff, international press, and diplomatic circles observed the easy familiarity between the general and his driver. Rumors began to circulate, but they were always unconfirmed, always softened by deniability. Eisenhower himself was cautious. Married to Mamie Dowd Eisenhower since 1916, he had a son, John, who was serving in the military. The image of a devoted family man anchored by duty and domesticity was central to his public identity. Any hint of impropriety would have had political and personal costs, even during wartime. For Summersby, the experience was transformative. After the war, she moved to the United States and became a U.S. citizen. In 1948, she published a memoir titled Eisenhower Was My Boss, which emphasized her professional role and described their relationship in measured terms. There were no direct confessions, no allegations, and no explicit acknowledgments of romance. It was, at most, a carefully curated recollection intended to respect both the general's privacy and her own. But the story didn't end there. In 1975, a year before her death from cancer, Summersby published a second memoir, Past Forgetting: My Love Affair with Dwight D. Eisenhower. In it, she recounted a much deeper emotional and romantic relationship. According to her account, they had fallen in love during the war. She described Eisenhower as torn between duty and emotion, constrained by his public responsibilities but intimately connected to her in private. She also claimed that he had intended to divorce Mamie and marry her after the war plans that were ultimately abandoned, reportedly due to pressure from higher authorities, including General George Marshall. Summersby wrote that while their relationship included emotional intimacy, it was not consummated sexually, attributing that to Eisenhower's stress and exhaustion. The tone of the memoir was not scandalous. It was reflective, tender, and infused with a kind of wistful detachment. She did not portray herself as a victim or Eisenhower as a betrayer. Instead, she offered a picture of two people who found connection in an extraordinary time and place, only to let it slip away in the aftermath. Historians have debated the authenticity of her later memoir. Some suggest that the second book was ghostwritten or embellished. Others accept it as a more truthful account, released only when the risk of reputational harm had passed. Eisenhower never commented on Summersby's accounts, either publicly or in private correspondence that has since become available. Mamie Eisenhower never spoke of Kay Summersby by name. Regardless of whether the relationship was romantic, platonic, or something in between, it is clear that Kay Summersby occupied a central place in Eisenhower's wartime life. Their bond, forged in the crucible of conflict, remained part of the historical record, even as it was largely erased from official biographies and military archives. It lived instead in memoirs, photographs, and the recollections of those who watched them from a distance. When Eisenhower returned to the United States after the war, he was greeted as a hero. His leadership during World War II made him one of the most respected military figures in American history. By the time he was elected president in 1952, he had fully transitioned from general to statesman, with a carefully cultivated image of moral integrity and national strength. There was no mention of Summersby during the campaign, no questions from reporters, no investigative pieces, no official acknowledgement of her role beyond standard military documentation. It was as though she had been edited out of the narrative, an omission made easier by the passage of time and the deference still afforded to wartime heroes. Yet the silence was not accidental. It reflected a broader pattern of public life in the mid-20th century. Personal relationships, no matter how meaningful or consequential, were kept separate from political legacy unless they erupted into scandal. In Eisenhower's case, the absence of public controversy preserved his reputation, but at the cost of a fuller understanding of his life. Summersby's accounts, particularly the second memoir, added nuance to that understanding. They portrayed Eisenhower not as a figure of controversy, but as a man deeply affected by the emotional toll of war, caught between the clarity of command and the murkiness of personal longing. The story's poignancy lies not in what happened, but in what was left unfulfilled. There is no definitive proof of the affair, no love letters, no recorded conversations, no confessions from Eisenhower himself. The evidence is circumstantial, anecdotal, and ultimately subjective. And yet, the consistency of Summersby's presence during key moments and the later reflection of her feelings leaves behind a compelling trace. Eisenhower's final years were quiet. He retired to his farm in Gettysburg, wrote his memoirs, and maintained a public persona marked by humility and patriotism. He died in 1969, never having addressed the lingering questions about Summersby. The story remained incomplete, not because it was hidden poorly, but because it was never truly confronted. In the broader context of presidential history, Eisenhower's relationship with Kay Summersby is not the most scandalous, nor the most well-documented, but it is one of the most emotionally complex. It represents a chapter in which the line between personal and professional, between secrecy and silence, was drawn not with malice, but with restraint. The mystery remains not in whether Eisenhower loved Summersby, but in why that love, if real, could only exist in the margins. It is a reminder that even those who command armies and shape history are subject to the quiet uncertainties of the heart, and that sometimes the most significant parts of a life are the ones that never made it into the official record. And while the war had faded and the general returned home, another president was rising, a man whose charm, charisma, and magnetism would define a new era. Unlike Eisenhower, he did not hide behind formality. He moved through life, surrounded by whispers, rumors, and fleeting glances, each one hinting at relationships as carefully managed as they were deliberately concealed. But these secrets, unlike those buried in war, would one day step into the light. John F. Kennedy. The camera loved him. The nation for a time did too. John F. Kennedy stepped into the American imagination not just as a leader, but as a symbol of youth, of vigor, of a new frontier. His voice was smooth, his posture effortless, and his presence magnetic. Details seemed rehearsed by history itself. But beneath the charisma, there was another cadence, running parallel to the public record. A quieter series of encounters, conversations, and connections that would only come into focus years after the applause had faded. From the earliest days of his political rise, whispers followed Kennedy. Stories of his charm with women, his flings, his midnight calls. At first, they were dismissed as speculation, the typical rumors that circulate around ambitious young politicians. But as time passed, the pattern became undeniable. Kennedy's private life, long shielded by a protective press and an inner circle bound by loyalty, revealed itself to be intricate, extensive, and above all, carefully managed. Among the most iconic and controversial names linked to JFK was Marilyn Monroe. Her performance of Happy Birthday, Mr. President, in Madison Square Garden in 1962, breathy, intimate, and undeniable in its implications, became a cultural touchstone. The details of their relationship remain murky. Some accounts claim it was a brief encounter, others suggest it was more. Monroe reportedly told close friends she had been involved with both John and his brother Robert. But no photographs, no letters, and no hard evidence have surfaced to definitively map the connection. What remains is the performance, the rumors, and Monroe's tragic death just months later. Kennedy's liaisons extended beyond Hollywood. In the early 1960s, he began a relationship with Judith Exner, who also had documented ties to mafia figure Sam Giancana. Exner later claimed she carried messages between the president and organized crime. The implications of her account drew attention in the 1970s, but they were never fully investigated. Kennedy never acknowledged the relationship publicly, and the paper trail was thin. Still, the idea that a sitting president might be romantically linked to a woman entangled in organized crime was a troubling notion, one that blurred the line between personal indiscretion and national vulnerability. Another name emerged in later years: Mimi Alford. She was a 19-year-old intern at the White House when she began what she later described as an affair with Kennedy. In her 2012 memoir, Once Upon a Secret, Alford recounted their relationship in detail, claiming it began 4 days into her internship and lasted over a year. Her account was direct, reflective, and presented without bitterness. She described Kennedy as distant, emotionally detached, and deeply compartmentalized. Their interactions took place in the private quarters of the White House, often during moments carved out between meetings and state dinners. Alford's story added a new dimension to the Kennedy mythos, one that suggested not just infidelity, but a pattern of emotional inaccessibility, facilitated by the machinery of power. She was not the only young staffer involved. Accounts have since surfaced of White House secretaries, codenamed Fiddle and Faddle by the Secret Service, who were part of the president's inner social circle and reportedly engaged in similar relationships with him. Their real names were Priscilla Weir and Jill Cowan. Their proximity to the Oval Office was both literal and symbolic, close enough to power to witness it, yet kept far from the public gaze. Throughout Kennedy's presidency, the press remained almost entirely silent on these matters. This was an era when journalists largely respected the private lives of politicians, operating under an informal code that personal conduct, no matter how questionable, was not the public's business unless it interfered with official duties. There were no investigative reports, no leaked memos, no tabloid coverage. The image of Kennedy as a devoted family man, complete with picture-perfect wife and children, went unchallenged by the mainstream media. Those within his administration were equally committed to preserving that image. Aides, Secret Service agents, and staff members operated with a clear understanding of what was acceptable to reveal and what wasn't. Access was tightly controlled. Movement was choreographed. Kennedy's schedule allowed room for discreet meetings, and the logistics were managed with precision. Rooms were cleared, calls were diverted, and when needed, explanations were improvised. The secrecy was not driven by fear of political fallout alone. Kennedy's team understood that the allure of his public persona, the charm, the glamour, the idealism, was a carefully maintained narrative. To rupture it, with revelations of extramarital affairs, would not only tarnish his reputation, but unravel the cultural fiction that had been so meticulously built around him. He was more than a president. He was a symbol. And symbols, by their nature, cannot be seen breaking character. Yet the personal cost of that compartmentalization remains a point of reflection. Those involved with Kennedy were rarely acknowledged, often forgotten, and sometimes left to carry the emotional weight alone. The president himself remained elusive, warm in gesture, but distant in substance. He connected easily, but seldom deeply. The intimacy he offered was fleeting, bracketed by protocol and time constraints. After his assassination in 1963, a flood of information was locked away. The Warren Commission focused on national security, not personal history. The stories of Kennedy's relationships remained whispers, passed through memoirs, oral histories, and eventual confessions. It wasn't until the 1990s and early 2000s, as new biographies emerged and cultural taboos shifted, that a more complete picture began to form. What is most striking is not the number of affairs, but the infrastructure built to support them. Kennedy's private life was not a series of isolated decisions, but a pattern that was enabled, concealed, and normalized within his orbit. There were no public scandals, no career-ending exposés, only a quiet consensus that certain things were not to be discussed. Today, Kennedy's legacy remains deeply complex. He is remembered for his leadership during the Cuban Missile Crisis, for advancing civil rights, for inspiring a generation with words about sacrifice and civic duty. But alongside that, legacy sits a more personal truth, one that speaks to the distance between public persona and private reality. The mystery is not about what happened behind closed doors. Much of that is now known, or at least accepted. The mystery lies in how so much was hidden so effectively for so long. How a figure so constantly in the spotlight managed to maintain a private life as layered and deliberate as his public one. And how those who knew the truth chose silence not out of fear, but out of a belief that the truth was too fragile to share. As the Kennedy era faded into memory, it left behind not just a sense of loss, but a sense of unfinished business. The story never reached resolution. The relationships were never reconciled. The women who knew him remained on the periphery, their roles left out of official accounts. Their names are remembered now, not because they were part of the political machine, but because their presence, once concealed, refused to disappear. And just as the camera pulled away from Camelot, another figure was stepping onto the stage. Less polished, more blunt, and unflinchingly direct. He would lead the country through a turbulent era, commanding meetings with unfiltered language and unapologetic presence. And behind the walls of power, stories would again begin to surface of late-night calls, whispered names, and another hidden life just beneath the official one. Lyndon B. Johnson. In the White House, Lyndon B. Johnson was everywhere at once. He moved through rooms with a commanding presence, spoke with unrelenting intensity, and expected answers before questions had finished forming. He governed not through quiet persuasion, but through force of will. His leadership style was famously direct, often overwhelming, sometimes crude. But beneath the loudness of his public persona was a man who, like others before him, compartmentalized his life with a practiced precision. And in those quiet corners, away from the cameras and press briefings, lived stories that would only partially emerge after his time in office had ended. Rumors of Johnson's extramarital affairs had circulated long before he became president. Some of them were whispered among journalists, others shared behind closed doors in political circles, but few ever reached the public. The press, still operating within a culture of professional courtesy when it came to politicians' private lives, refrained from publishing unverified allegations. And Johnson, aware of the power of image, maintained tight control over what could be seen, heard, or inferred. The woman most frequently named in discussions of Johnson's private life was Alice Glass, a prominent Texas socialite and the wife of a powerful newspaper executive. Their connection dated back to the 1930s, during Johnson's early congressional years. Glass was known for her intelligence, her influence, and her support of liberal causes, traits that appealed to Johnson both politically and personally. Their relationship was the subject of quiet speculation for years. Observers noted their frequent meetings and private dinners, but hard evidence was scarce. No letters, no confirmed photographs, no direct accounts from either party. Still, those within Johnson's circle seemed to acknowledge the possibility, if not the certainty, of the relationship. The president's aides, particularly those who had been with him since his Senate days, were often described as fiercely loyal and unfailingly discreet. The code of silence extended not just to political strategy, but to personal matters. If Johnson's relationships extended beyond the formal bounds of his marriage, they were handled with discretion, protected by routine, and rarely spoken of. Johnson himself occasionally made comments that hinted at a broader personal life than what was publicly visible. Biographers and oral historians have documented moments in which the president joked crudely and often confidently about his virility. He was known to discuss his private life in ways that blurred the line between braggadocio and confession. Some interpreted this as part of his larger-than-life personality. Others saw it as a shield, a way to deflect attention from more specific inquiries. There were also suggestions that Johnson used his authority to maintain control over relationships. Staff members were said to coordinate personal visits, manage access, and ensure privacy during certain hours of the day. These accounts, though fragmentary, paint a picture of a highly structured system in which the president's private desires were managed alongside his official responsibilities. Yet, Despite the logistics, very little ever became public during his lifetime. Lady Bird Johnson, the president's wife, was widely admired for her grace and steadiness. She was a central figure in his political life, involved in campaigns, policy discussions, and public appearances. Their marriage, while publicly stable, was not often characterized as emotionally close. Lady Bird's diaries and public statements rarely addressed their personal relationship in detail. If she was aware of Johnson's private affairs, she chose not to speak of them. Her silence was part of a broader culture, one that prioritized unity, discretion, and the maintenance of public image over personal disclosure. One of the few moments when Johnson's private life threatened to intersect with public discourse came after his presidency, through the work of journalist and author Robert Caro. In Caro's multi-volume biography of Johnson, subtle references to his relationships appear, often carefully worded, often without full elaboration. Caro, known for his thoroughness and restraint, chose not to speculate where evidence was thin. Still, the implications were clear. Johnson's personal life was more complicated than public records suggested. Decades after his death, new accounts began to surface, some from former staff, others from individuals claiming knowledge of relationships Johnson had during his political career. One name that emerged was Madeline Brown, a Texas woman who claimed to have had a long-standing affair with Johnson and even alleged that he fathered her son. Brown's claims, while persistent, were never substantiated through documentation or verified testimony. Historians remain divided on their credibility, and her story has been treated with skepticism by many in the academic community. Despite the ambiguity, the recurring theme is consistency. Multiple sources, independent of each other, have pointed to Johnson's private relationships as a part of his life that was carefully kept out of sight. It wasn't scandal in the conventional sense. There were no court cases, no public denials, no resignations. Instead, it was an architecture of omission. The truth, if known, was treated as irrelevant unless it interfered with governance. And that, perhaps, is what defines Johnson's place in the broader pattern. His private life was guarded not by innocence, but by pragmatism. What mattered, in his view and in the view of those around him, was not fidelity, but function. He was a man driven by results, legislation passed, wars fought, elections won. Sentimentality had little space in his world, and that applied as much to personal relationships as it did to political alliances. But the absence of overt scandal does not erase the question. Johnson's life was filled with moments of contradiction, deep commitments to civil rights alongside the escalation of war, visionary domestic programs paired with blunt personal tactics. His relationships, both public and private, followed the same pattern. They were strategic, controlled, and always wrapped in the logic of power. As history continues to examine Johnson's presidency, the stories at its edges remain unfinished. They do not alter the trajectory of his legislative accomplishments, but they add texture to the man who stood behind the microphone. They remind us that public service does not erase personal complexity, and that even the most disciplined lives are shaped by unseen decisions. And as Johnson's era gave way to the cultural upheaval of the 1970s and the rise of televised scandal, a new precedent would be set, one in which secrecy would no longer be sustainable and silence would no longer be an effective strategy. The next story would not wait decades to come to light. It would erupt in real time through headlines, investigations, televised hearings, and sworn testimony. And for the first time in modern history, the private life of a president would lead directly to the threshold of impeachment. Bill Clinton. It began with a denial firm, unblinking, rehearsed. "I did not have sexual relations with that woman, Miss Lewinsky." The words echoed across television screens, radio stations, and newspaper front pages. They were spoken on the 26th of January, 1998, in front of a sea of reporters, with the weight of the American presidency behind them. And for a brief moment, they held. But history, as always, was already moving in another direction. William Jefferson Clinton, the 42nd President of the United States, had spent his political career navigating and surviving controversy. He was charismatic, intelligent, and instinctively political. But his private life had long been the subject of rumors. From his years as governor of Arkansas to the early days of his presidential campaign, questions about his relationships with women trailed him like a shadow. Most were unproven, some were denied. A few faded into speculation, and then came Monica Lewinsky. Lewinsky was a 22-year-old White House intern in 1995 when she began what would later be classified as a sexual relationship with the president. Their interactions took place in the Oval Office, the private study, and the hallway just outside the map room. The relationship, according to Lewinsky, was consensual and emotionally complicated. Clinton, then in his late 40s, was already a seasoned political figure and married to Hillary Rodham Clinton, a lawyer and activist in her own right. The affair was hidden from public view for nearly 2 years. It remained known only to a small circle of aides, friends, and eventually investigators. The turning point came when Linda Tripp, a colleague of Lewinsky at the Pentagon, began secretly recording their conversations. Tripp, concerned about what she perceived as a pattern of misconduct, delivered the tapes to independent counsel Kenneth Starr, who had been investigating Clinton on unrelated matters involving the Whitewater real estate dealings. The Starr investigation quickly expanded to include the Lewinsky affair. What began as a private relationship became a national legal proceeding. Lewinsky was subpoenaed. Clinton was questioned under oath. And the careful edifice of secrecy that had shielded the affair began to crack. The president's initial denial became a focal point not just of media scrutiny, but of legal consequence. On the 17th of August, 1998, after months of public pressure and investigative evidence, Clinton admitted to an inappropriate relationship with Lewinsky in a televised address to the nation. The consequences were immediate. The House of Representatives initiated impeachment proceedings on charges of perjury and obstruction of justice. The Senate held a trial. The public watched as constitutional procedures collided with personal decisions. In February 1999, Clinton was acquitted on both charges and completed his second term in office, but the stain on his presidency remained. The affair with Lewinsky was not Clinton's first alleged infidelity. During his 1992 campaign, Jennifer Flowers, a former Arkansas state employee, came forward with claims of a long-term affair. Clinton initially denied the relationship, but under oath in 1998, he admitted to a sexual encounter. Other women, including Kathleen Willey and Paula Jones, made accusations ranging from consensual relationships to unwanted advances. Each case had its own legal and emotional terrain, and many remain the subject of ongoing debate. What distinguishes the Lewinsky affair from these other cases is not just the degree of exposure, but the way it redefined the relationship between personal conduct and public office. Never before had a sitting president's private behavior been dissected with such precision in real time. Never before had the balance between image and reality been tested so publicly. And never before had the press, the judiciary, and the public collided so forcefully over a matter that began in a quiet corner of the West Wing. The fallout for Lewinsky was severe. She became a public figure overnight, subject to intense media scrutiny, public shaming, and personal attacks. Her privacy was shattered. Her name became shorthand for scandal. In later interviews, Lewinsky described the emotional toll, the loss of agency, and the years of isolation that followed. Only in the 2010s, with cultural conversations around power and consent evolving, did her story begin to be re-examined through a different lens, one that acknowledged the imbalance between a young intern and the most powerful man in the world. Clinton, meanwhile, remained a formidable political presence. After leaving office, he maintained high approval ratings, engaged in philanthropic work, and continued to influence Democratic politics. His supporters often pointed to the economic prosperity of the 1990s, his legislative achievements, and his international diplomacy. His detractors, however, continued to raise questions about integrity, accountability, and the broader implications of his personal choices. The Clinton-Lewinsky scandal also reshaped journalism. It marked the rise of 24-hour cable news, the birth of online political media, and the growing influence of partisan commentary. Traditional boundaries between public and private life were eroded. Personal behavior was no longer off-limits. Every gesture, every rumor, every whisper became fair game. In the years that followed, memoirs were published. Testimonies were revisited. The legacy of the affair remained a touchstone in discussions about ethics, leadership, and the human vulnerabilities of public figures. Clinton addressed it only intermittently, often with a mix of regret and defensiveness. Lewinsky, through writing and public speaking, reclaimed some measure of narrative control, speaking openly about trauma, resilience, and the shifting cultural landscape. What emerged from the Clinton era was a new standard. The private could become public at any moment. The insulation that had once protected the personal lives of presidents had dissolved. From that point forward, secrecy was no longer sustainable through silence alone. It required an entirely different calculus. Yet, for all its visibility, the affair with Monica Lewinsky left certain questions unanswered. Not about what happened that much, by now, is known in detail, but about what it meant. Was it a failure of character or a function of power? Was it an isolated event or part of a broader pattern? Was the response to it proportionate or politically motivated? These questions have been debated for decades and will likely continue to be. The story endures because it sits at the intersection of identity, responsibility, and image. It is not simply about a man and a woman, but about a culture, a system, and the shifting line between private life and public consequence. It reminds us that the presidency, for all its formal power, is also a profoundly human role, one shaped by impulse, contradiction, and fallibility. And as the Clinton presidency drew to a close, another shift was already underway. The new millennium brought with it a new kind of secrecy, less about denial, more about negotiation. One rooted in the 19th century, yet still echoing in today's conversations. A different time, a different scandal, and a different man who had once been accused of something that was buried not by lawyers or spin, but by the passage of time itself. A story that began in 1884 with a whisper about a child born out of wedlock and a campaign built on silence. Grover Cleveland. In the summer of 1884, the whispers grew louder. They weren't about tariffs or trade deals or foreign policy. They were about a child, a boy born out of wedlock, and the man who might have been his father. The man in question was Grover Cleveland, governor of New York and the Democratic nominee for president. At first, the story was printed in pamphlets and passed along in hushed tones. Then it reached the newspapers. And then it reached the campaign. Cleveland was 47 years old. He had never married. His public image was one of stern integrity and deliberate simplicity. He was the kind of politician who emphasized duty over charm, silence over spectacle. But the 1884 campaign would test the limits of that image. The accusation was this: Grover Cleveland had fathered a child with a woman named Maria Halpin. The affair, it was said, occurred a decade earlier in Buffalo, where both lived. According to Halpin's account, one that would emerge only partially and under heavy scrutiny, Cleveland had pursued her, and what followed was not merely a consensual affair, but a brief, fraught relationship with serious consequences. Halpin claimed that Cleveland, who at the time was a well-known lawyer and bachelor, had coerced her into intimacy, and when she became pregnant, he distanced himself. When she gave birth to a son, named Oscar Folsom Cleveland, she said she was institutionalized without cause, and her child placed in an orphanage arrangements that, according to records, involved figures closely tied to Cleveland's political and legal network. Cleveland's response was swift and, for its time, considered unusual in its partial acknowledgement. Rather than deny the affair outright, he admitted to having had a relationship with Halpin and to supporting the child financially. His defenders emphasized that he had done the honorable thing under difficult circumstances. They argued that Halpin had been involved with multiple men, and that Cleveland, not certain of paternity, had taken responsibility regardless, an act that, in their view, showed character rather than guilt. The press, ever polarized, took sides. Republican-leaning newspapers ran headlines like, "Mama, where's my pa?" turning the accusation into a campaign chant. Democratic papers responded with, "Gone to the White House, ha ha ha," an early example of political counterbranding. What could have become a career-ending scandal was instead woven into the fabric of Cleveland's candidacy, almost as a badge of reluctant honesty. Behind the slogans, though, was a woman whose voice was barely heard. Maria Halpin gave a statement through sympathetic press outlets, but her version of events was quickly overwhelmed by the machinery of political narrative. Questions about her mental health, her reliability, and her personal life were circulated widely, an early example of character assassination in the public square. She was portrayed alternately as a seductress, a scorned woman, and an unreliable witness. Her story faded as Cleveland's campaign surged. Cleveland won the election. His victory was narrow, but definitive, and once in office, the controversy receded. There were no more public statements. Halpin and her son disappeared from the headlines. Cleveland later married Frances Folsom, the daughter of his former law partner, who was 21 years old at the time and 27 years his junior. Their marriage was celebrated in the press. The affair, by then more than a decade old, was reduced to a footnote. But the record, once examined more closely, reveals a deeper story, one of power, reputation, and the way certain truths were managed rather than confronted. Cleveland never met the child again. Oscar Folsom Cleveland was adopted by another family and lived a life away from the political spotlight. Halpin herself moved to the Midwest and lived under her married name, almost entirely erased from the national memory. The incident resurfaced only occasionally in later biographies, often downplayed or framed as a political tactic rather than a moral failing. The focus remained on Cleveland's public virtues, his vetoes, his battles against corruption, his status as the only president to serve 2 non-consecutive terms. The personal, as was typical of the era, remained background noise. Yet the story of Maria Halpin deserves its own space in the historical record. It speaks to the dynamics of 19th century power, how easily a woman's account could be contested, how swiftly reputations were sacrificed, and how willingly a political system closed ranks around one of its own. The nature of her relationship with Cleveland remains, to this day, a subject of debate. Some historians argue it was an affair distorted by political enemies. Others see it as an example of coercion, masked by the language of duty and discretion. The truth likely lives somewhere in between, clouded by missing documents and biased reporting. But what remains clear is this: Halpin's experience was shaped not just by her encounter with Cleveland, but by the structures that allowed her voice to be overwhelmed. The power imbalance was not limited to age, gender, or status. It extended to credibility: who was believed, who was heard, and who was protected. Cleveland's handling of the situation, his admission, his financial support, and his refusal to dwell on it may have been seen as admirable restraint at the time. But in retrospect, it reveals a strategy of control. Admit just enough to seem accountable, deny just enough to avoid consequences. It worked. He became president, twice. And as history moved on, the story of the child born in secret, the woman erased by scandal, and the president who left them both behind became another quiet chapter in a tradition that was far from over. Because the pattern didn't stop there. The next figure in this long lineage of secrecy would take a different approach. A professor turned president, a man of intellect and principle, who found himself drawn into companionship that defied the expectations of his role. His relationships would not erupt into scandal or courtroom drama, but they would leave questions lingering in the margins. Softly spoken names, private visits, letters exchanged and then destroyed. A man who sought solace, not in defiance, but in quiet distance. Woodrow Wilson. To the public, Woodrow Wilson was a figure of moral clarity, a scholar president, deeply principled, intellectually precise. He spoke of self-determination, of peace without victory, and of the enduring value of democracy. His speeches were laced with academic cadence, his manner measured, almost austere. But behind the crafted image of the professor-president was a personal life, threaded with a quieter, more enigmatic tension, a story of affection and emotional intimacy that unfolded just beyond the reach of public scrutiny. Wilson's early personal life was marked by convention. He married Ellen Axon in 1885, and their marriage, by most accounts, was emotionally stable and intellectually compatible. They had 3 daughters and shared a deep spiritual connection, with both drawn to Presbyterian faith and the rituals of Southern domestic life. Ellen was deeply engaged in social causes, an artist in her own right, and a critical sounding board during Wilson's academic and political ascent. When she died in August 1914, only a year and a half into Wilson's first presidential term, the loss was profound and disorienting. Wilson was devastated. Friends and aides described him as emotionally adrift in the weeks following her death, withdrawn and unmoored. The rigor that had defined his public life gave way to a private grief that was less often documented but unmistakably severe. It was during this period, barely 5 months after Ellen's passing, that Edith Bolingault entered his life. Edith was a widowed socialite from Washington, D.C., sharp-minded, confident, and accustomed to navigating social circles with grace. Their introduction was arranged by mutual acquaintances who believed Wilson needed companionship. From their first meeting in March 1915, the connection between them deepened rapidly. Wilson wrote letters filled with affection and vulnerability. He proposed marriage just a few months after they met. At the time, the speed of the courtship raised eyebrows among the president's staff and the public alike. There were concerns about propriety, optics, and the risk of political distraction. Some feared that remarrying so soon after Ellen's death would seem disrespectful. Others worried about Edith's influence on Wilson's judgment. But despite these concerns, the relationship continued, and Wilson married Edith in December 1915 in a private ceremony. What remains less discussed, and more complex, is the nature of Wilson's emotional life before and between these 2 marriages. Specifically, his close and sustained connection with Mary Hulbert Peck, a relationship that began in the 1900s, long before he entered the White House, and lingered in the background for years. Peck was a New York socialite and widow, known for her charm, wit, and emotional intelligence. Wilson met her while on a summer holiday and quickly became emotionally attached. Letters exchanged between them reveal a strong emotional intimacy, though the surviving correspondence is largely one-sided, with only Wilson's letters available. In these, he expressed longing, admiration, and emotional reliance. He referred to her affectionately, praised her insight, and confided in her deeply. The tone of the letters suggested a closeness that surpassed mere friendship. Historians have debated the nature of their relationship. Was it a romantic affair, an emotional entanglement, or simply a deep and unconventional friendship? The lack of explicit language in the letters leaves room for interpretation. But what is clear is that Mary Peck held a special place in Wilson's private life, one that persisted even during his presidency. The possibility of an affair with Peck became a matter of concern during the 1912 election, when opponents suggested that their relationship was improper. No formal allegations were made, and Wilson denied any wrongdoing. The press, as was often the case in that era, did not pursue the story with vigor. The matter faded, not because it was resolved, but because the cultural and political climate allowed it to be set aside. What adds depth to this narrative is how Wilson navigated these private affections without allowing them to publicly intersect with his role. There were no scandals, no public denials or apologies, no televised testimonies, and yet these relationships shaped his emotional world. They influenced his temperament, his decision-making, and perhaps even his resilience during moments of political crisis. Edith's role in Wilson's life became especially significant during his second term. After suffering a debilitating stroke in October 1919, Wilson was left partially paralyzed and largely incapacitated. During this period, Edith effectively managed access to the president, acting as a gatekeeper for communications and decisions. Historians continue to debate the extent of her influence, with some describing it as a stewardship, others as a shadow presidency. Regardless of the characterization, it is clear that she held extraordinary power in the final months of his administration. Whether Wilson's emotional reliance on Edith mirrored his earlier connection with Peck is difficult to say. The available evidence paints different portraits, one of youthful, affectionate correspondence with Mary, and another of later life partnership and pragmatic dependence with Edith. What connects them is not scandal, but the centrality of intimacy in Wilson's life, a theme rarely emphasized in historical accounts, focused on his intellect and policies. There is no definitive evidence that Wilson's relationships crossed boundaries considered inappropriate by the standards of his time. But the very persistence of these connections, quiet, undocumented, personally significant, invites reflection on the boundaries between public leadership and private longing. His presidency was defined by principle and rhetoric, by sweeping moral visions and exacting demands. But beneath those speeches were letters written by hand, moments of vulnerability, and the presence of women who saw a different version of the man. Mary Peck's legacy is barely remembered. She never published memoirs, gave no interviews, and left behind little in the way of public record. Her existence in the historical record survives primarily through the remnants of correspondence and the recollections of those who knew her. Edith, by contrast, became a public figure at times controversial, but undeniably central to Wilson's later presidency. What remains elusive is how Wilson reconciled these emotional worlds. Did he see them as contradictions, or as necessary balances to a life lived under constant pressure? Did he compartmentalize by habit or by necessity? The answers, like so many from his time, are lost to history, not erased, but left unrecorded. Wilson's legacy, both celebrated and contested, often emphasizes the grand scope of his ideals: the League of Nations, progressive reform, and moral diplomacy. But the emotional undercurrents of his life offer a different lens, one that humanizes the professor-president and reveals the complexity of personal connection in an age that demanded discretion. As Wilson's presidency drew to a close, the era of silence was nearing its end. The 20th century was giving way to louder, faster revelations. Presidents would soon find it harder to keep personal matters hidden. Technology would evolve, the press would evolve, and so would the public's expectations. Because in the decades to follow, even the most tightly held secrets would struggle to remain secrets. DNA tests would replace denials. Private letters would be published. Affairs that once dissolved into rumor would resurface with proof. And as the century turned, the stories would grow more visible, and the boundaries between legacy and intimacy would be tested again. George Washington. There are certain figures in American history who exist more as monuments than men. George Washington, the first president, stands in that pantheon stoic, deliberate, unyielding. The mythology that surrounds him is nearly impenetrable. The military general who refused the crown, the reluctant leader who set the precedent for power transferred through peace, the incorruptible founder who allegedly could not tell a lie. Yet in the vast silence of that towering image, there are murmurs faint, uncertain about what may have lingered beneath the surface of his carefully preserved legacy. Washington married Martha Dandridge Custis in 1759. She was wealthy, respected, and widowed, bringing with her 2 children and considerable land holdings. Their marriage was not one of scandal or drama, but one of social alignment and mutual benefit. There is little doubt that they cared for one another deeply, but theirs was not a marriage documented by passion. Letters between them were mostly destroyed, likely by Washington himself, leaving behind only fragments of their private world. The few surviving correspondences are cordial, formal, and affectionate, but distant enough to invite speculation. One such speculation, whispered across generations but never definitively proven, involves Venus, an enslaved woman on the Washington plantation, and her son, West Ford. The story is simple, and, like many such stories, almost too quiet to be noticed, unless one is already listening. West Ford was born in 1784, the child of Venus, who was enslaved by Washington's extended family. Family oral histories passed down through the generations of Ford's descendants suggest that George Washington may have been his father. Historians have approached this claim with measured skepticism. The documentary evidence is thin, and there are logistical inconsistencies. Washington was not known to be present at the location where West Ford was born around the estimated time of conception. Yet, the oral history remains remarkably consistent across generations. West Ford was later freed and given land, an unusual act, though not unprecedented. He was educated, entrusted with responsibilities, and treated with a level of dignity that was not commonly extended to formerly enslaved people during that time. The Ford family insists that this treatment was not random, but deliberate, rooted in a paternal connection that could never be spoken aloud. The possibility, however slim, invites a reevaluation of the man known more for restraint than indulgence. Washington, unlike many of his contemporaries, was not known for scandal or impropriety. He maintained a rigid personal discipline, crafted an image of measured control, and rarely allowed emotion to surface publicly. But he was also a man of his time, a slaveholder who understood the human cost of his wealth, even as he wrestled with its implications. In private, Washington expressed discomfort with the institution of slavery. In his will, he arranged for the emancipation of the enslaved people he personally owned, though not those owned through his wife's estate. It was a complicated moral gesture, emblematic of the contradictions that marked the founding era. Whether that discomfort extended into his personal relationships with those he enslaved is an open question, one that history may never answer definitively. The case of West Ford remains unresolved. DNA testing has not been conclusive, largely because Washington had no acknowledged children and therefore no direct male descendants through whom a Y chromosome lineage could be established. Efforts to trace genetic links through collateral relatives have been attempted, but the results are, at best, ambiguous. The truth, if it exists, lies somewhere between probability and silence. Other stories from Washington's earlier years hint at emotional connections that never fully developed. His youthful admiration for Sally Carey Fairfax, the wife of his close friend George William Fairfax, has been well documented through his own letters. These early correspondences reveal a young Washington still finding his place in the world, expressing a romantic longing that would never be reciprocated. By the time he married Martha, he had long since tucked away any hopes of that earlier affection, but the letters linger careful, elegant, revealing just enough to suggest the inner conflict. What all these stories share is ambiguity. Unlike the affairs of later presidents, which would be exposed in real time through memoirs, DNA, or journalism, Washington's alleged relationships exist only in the margins, rumored, hinted at, preserved through silence. They resist confirmation not because they are false, but because they come from a time when silence was easier to maintain. There is no scandal in these stories, only possibility. They do not alter Washington's legacy, but they do remind us that even the most revered lives are lived in full, with complexities, emotions, and decisions that don't fit neatly into textbooks. The myth of Washington as marble perfect was always a construction, reinforced by centuries of reverence. To consider what might have existed in his private life is not to undermine his contribution, but to understand that no legacy is entirely immune to the realities of human intimacy. And perhaps that's the deeper lesson here. The story of George Washington and West Ford, whether fact or family belief, reflects something intrinsic about how history is remembered. When the facts are incomplete, the gaps are filled not just with speculation, but with meaning. These meanings become part of lineage, of identity, of legacy. They outlive the denials. As the 18th century gave way to the 19th, these private lives remained out of reach, protected by status, forgotten by design. But eventually, those quiet margins would begin to fill. New stories would rise from the archives, bringing names long absent from textbooks back into view. And one of the next to do so would be a man whose own presidency lasted barely a month, but whose alleged past would echo across generations, an affair not with a socialite or an intern, but, again, with someone enslaved. William Henry Harrison. The presidency of William Henry Harrison is best remembered for its brevity. Just 31 days after taking the oath of office in 1841, he died of pneumonia, becoming the first American president to die in office, and still holding the record for the shortest presidential term. His time in the White House was so brief that it left little room for controversy, scandal, or the layered public relationships that later administrations would struggle to contain. But the past, as always, reaches further back than the office itself. And in Harrison's case, the story that lingers exists not within his presidency, but within the unresolved gaps of his earlier life, a life lived in proximity to power, war, and slavery. Born in 1773 into one of Virginia's most prominent families, Harrison was steeped in the traditions of plantation aristocracy from birth. His father, Benjamin Harrison V, was a signer of the Declaration of Independence. His education, military commission, and eventual political career followed a trajectory not uncommon for men of his class and region. Land ownership, military leadership, and slavery were interwoven into both his personal fortune and his public ascent. What has persisted, quietly, but with steady resilience, is the claim that William Henry Harrison fathered several children with an enslaved woman named Dilcia. The story did not emerge from official biographies or newspaper reports, but from oral history, specifically the family traditions of Black descendants who trace their lineage back to Harrison through Dilcia and her children. One of these alleged descendants was Walter Francis White, a prominent civil rights activist and leader of the NAACP in the early 20th century. White, whose complexion allowed him to navigate both Black and white social spaces, was often questioned about his ancestry. He reportedly claimed descent from Harrison through Dilcia, and his family preserved this lineage across generations, despite the absence of official records to support it. In an era where acknowledgement of such relationships was rare and documentation scarcer still, these claims were sustained through names, stories, and family memory. Historical verification of this connection is difficult. No formal acknowledgement from Harrison exists, and the structure of plantation record-keeping was not designed to document relationships that blurred the line between ownership and paternity. The children born from such unions were often listed simply as property unnamed, numbered, or identified only by their mother. This erasure complicates efforts to construct a definitive account. However, certain contextual patterns provide circumstantial support. Harrison, like many of his contemporaries, owned slaves throughout his life. As a military leader and territorial governor, he wielded authority across the Northwest Territory, including Indiana and Ohio regions where slavery was technically outlawed but continued in practice under various legal justifications. His home life and professional operations depended on enslaved labor, and it was not uncommon for men of his station to exploit that dynamic for personal gratification. The story of Dilcia, if true, would not have been unique in the broader context of American history, but it would remain significant for its persistence. Oral histories, particularly those passed down within African American communities, often served as repositories for truths that were systematically excluded from written records. They carried not just facts, but memory, and with that, identity. These stories endured despite social pressure, legal silence, and institutional disinterest. The reluctance of historians to fully engage with these claims in earlier decades was symptomatic of a broader discomfort. Presidential biographies, particularly those written in the 19th and early 20th centuries, often sidestepped issues of race, paternity, and sexual coercion. The image of a founding-era statesman did not easily accommodate the realities of slavery's intimacy. But as scholarship has evolved, there has been a renewed willingness to examine these uncomfortable truths not as scandal, but as history. The implications of the Harrison-Dilcia story are not about character assassination, they are about acknowledgement, about how private lives intersected with public legacies in ways that were deliberately obscured, about the moral contradictions that shaped not only individuals but institutions, and about the enduring resonance of those private decisions, long after they were made. Harrison's own writings give little away. He was a man of his time in the most literal sense, formally educated, politically ambitious, and firmly committed to the structures that benefited him. There is no record of personal reflection on the institution of slavery, no letters indicating conflict or doubt. If he felt anything beyond routine ownership toward the people he enslaved, he left no record of it. Yet the children born of these relationships, whether acknowledged or not, were real. They lived, worked, struggled, and passed their stories forward. Their existence speaks to a different kind of legacy, one that cannot be measured in military victories or political appointments. It is a legacy written in the lives that continued outside the official narrative. As with other presidents alleged to have fathered children with enslaved women, the question is not just whether it happened, it's why we continue to ask, and why the answers remain elusive. The historical record was never designed to preserve these stories. In many cases, it was designed to erase them. And so we are left with fragments. A name here, a birth date there, a family's memory held tightly over generations. What endures is not the scandal, but the silence. And what lingers is the quiet symmetry between history's omissions and the voices that refuse to be forgotten. From Harrison's brief presidency, there is little to reflect on in terms of policy or reform. But from his life, long before the oath of office was taken, there emerges a story that challenges the very structure of how legacy is formed. A story passed not through archives, but through descendants. And just as Harrison's name faded quickly from the headlines of his day, another man's would rise not just to power, but into a whirlwind of legal recognition, family disputes, and historical revision. A man whose presidency would follow decades later, but whose personal decisions would resurface with names, documents, and testimony. Because the next chapter, like the one before it, begins not with a headline, but with a name whispered across generations. John Tyler. John Tyler, the 10th President of the United States, is often remembered as the unexpected successor, a man whose presidency began with the death of William Henry Harrison, and who would spend much of his term defending the legitimacy of his office. He was the first vice president to ascend to the presidency by virtue of death, a constitutional ambiguity at the time, and one he interpreted decisively. But while history has largely defined Tyler by his battles over executive power, the shadow of his private life stretches far beyond those political boundaries. Tyler was a Virginian, born into wealth and tradition. Like many of his contemporaries, he was raised in the planter class, where slavery was a given and personal relationships existed within rigid hierarchies of class and race. He married Letitia Christian Tyler in 1813, and together they had 8 children. Letitia was a private, religious woman who preferred to remain largely out of the public eye. She suffered from chronic illness, and by the time Tyler assumed the presidency in 1841, she was too ill to take on the traditional role of First Lady. She died in 1842, the first president's wife to die while her husband was in office. After Letitia's death, Tyler then, in his early 50s, married Julia Gardner, a 24-year-old New York socialite, in 1844. The match was widely reported and discussed, not only because of the age difference, but because it marked the first time a sitting president married while in office. Their union produced 7 children, bringing Tyler's total to 15 more than any other U.S. president. That number alone suggests a domestic life that was prolific, if not always publicly examined. But outside his 2 marriages, a separate narrative has circulated, one largely absent from conventional histories and unconfirmed by formal documentation, yet passed along in oral traditions and family lineages. According to some accounts, Tyler fathered additional children with at least one enslaved woman during his years as a plantation owner in Virginia. These accounts are not supported by surviving letters or birth records that name him directly, but they are kept alive through consistent genealogical claims and family oral history among African American descendants who trace their lineage back to the Tyler estate. One of the most frequently cited cases involves a woman who, according to oral history, bore Tyler's children while enslaved at Sherwood Forest Plantation, his Virginia estate. The identity of the woman varies depending on the source, and no clear documentation survives to confirm the relationship. However, multiple African American families in the region continue to pass down stories of descent from Tyler, with timelines and geographic proximity lending some degree of plausibility to the claim. These stories persist, not because they have been definitively proven, but because they fill in the gaps left by a historical record that was never intended to capture the full lives of the enslaved. In the antebellum South, relationships between white landowners and enslaved women were often undocumented, and when they were acknowledged at all, it was through indirect references, omissions, or euphemisms. Children born from such unions were typically enslaved themselves, denied recognition, and absorbed into the labor force without mention in family trees or legal documents. The question, then, is not whether John Tyler could have fathered children with enslaved women. He certainly had the opportunity, the power, and the cultural cover. The question is whether we are willing to consider these oral histories as part of the broader tapestry of presidential legacy, even in the absence of signed paternity acknowledgments or surviving letters. Tyler's known views on slavery suggest a man deeply embedded in the plantation culture that made such relationships possible. He was a staunch defender of states' rights and slavery, a position that led him to side with the Confederacy during the Civil War. In fact, Tyler was elected to the Confederate House of Representatives shortly before his death in 1862, making him the only former U.S. president to actively align himself with the secessionist cause. His beliefs were not peripheral, they were central to his identity, both political and personal. That context matters when evaluating the plausibility of claims about his personal life. Tyler's world was one in which enslaved women had no legal autonomy, and white men faced no consequences for crossing boundaries of intimacy and coercion. The silence in the record is not evidence of innocence, it is evidence of erasure. A system that required no confession and tolerated no complaint. It's also worth noting the pattern. Tyler is not the only early president with such rumors attached to his name. The stories of Jefferson and Hemmings, of Harrison and Dilcia, of Washington and Westford form a quiet chorus beneath the more familiar stories of wars and treaties and manifest destinies. These are the personal histories that were not carved into monuments, but lived out in shadows, stories preserved by descendants who had only each other to affirm their truth. For many of these descendants, the legacy is not about claiming presidential heritage for prestige or recognition. It is about reclaiming space in a narrative that has long excluded them. It is about acknowledging that these relationships, however, define and shape the lives of their ancestors in irreversible ways. And it is about refusing to let that truth be buried just because it lacks a paper trail. John Tyler's official biography remains largely silent on these matters. His political legacy is complicated, but his personal legacy, at least in the traditional sense, is rarely challenged. He died in obscurity, loyal to a nation that no longer exists, buried under a Confederate flag. His public story is over. But the private story continues, through families that still tell the same story, through names that recur across generations, through DNA tests taken in curiosity, yielding ambiguous or suggestive results, through quiet cemeteries where gravestones stand without surnames, and through family reunions where history is reconstructed piece by piece. There is no conclusive document, no signature on a birth record, no admission in a letter. There may never be. But history, especially the kind that has been silenced, does not always leave clean lines. Sometimes it leaves trails faint, persistent, and waiting to be followed. And as those trails stretch further into the modern era, another man would rise to power, a president who, more than a century later, would face similar rumors. But this time, the technology would be different. The politics would be different. And the woman at the center of the story would work not in the fields of a plantation, but in the West Wing of the White House. George H.W. Bush. George Herbert Walker Bush was a man shaped by tradition. Born into a family of wealth and political pedigree, educated at Yale, a World War II naval aviator, and later a congressman, ambassador, CIA director, and vice president before ascending to the presidency in 1989. His public life was one of service, diplomacy, and the measured restraint that typified the late Cold War era. His image, statesmanlike, reserved, and grounded in propriety, stood in sharp contrast to the political theater that would follow in later decades. But even the most controlled appearances are not immune to rumor. And beneath the polished surface of Bush's legacy, there emerged quiet, persistent claims, suggestions of an affair, and of a personal life, far more complex than the public ever truly saw. The name most frequently associated with these allegations is Jennifer Fitzgerald, a longtime aide who worked closely with Bush from the early 1970s through the end of his presidency. Fitzgerald served in several official capacities, first as an executive assistant during his time at the United Nations, then as a scheduler and personal secretary during his tenure as vice president and president. To outside observers, she was a trusted staffer, but to those who watched closely, she was something more, ever present, fiercely loyal, and seemingly indispensable. Rumors of an affair between Bush and Fitzgerald began as quiet speculation within political circles. Their closeness was noted by members of the press, some of whom later admitted to having heard the whispers but choosing not to report them. At the time, the unspoken rule still held private lives were off limits unless they interfered with public duty. And Bush, known for his discretion and emotional control, was not someone whose behavior suggested scandal. Still, the rumors persisted. In the early 1990s, journalist Jack Anderson reported that Bush had been having a long-running affair with Fitzgerald. Citing unnamed sources and pointing to her near-constant presence in his professional life, the White House firmly denied the claims. Fitzgerald herself remained silent, never granting interviews or addressing the speculation directly. No letters were leaked, no photographs surfaced, and no first-hand testimonies emerged to substantiate the story. But some details were harder to ignore. Fitzgerald had unusually broad access to Bush, traveling frequently with him, appearing at events not typical for her rank, and maintaining a level of personal familiarity that raised eyebrows. White House insiders later spoke, anonymously, of the open secret that surrounded their relationship, well known, never acknowledged, and carefully managed. Barbara Bush, George's wife of more than 70 years, never commented publicly on the allegations. Their marriage, often described as a partnership rooted in shared values and mutual respect, was not without strain. In her later memoirs, Barbara wrote candidly about periods of depression and personal difficulty during her husband's long political career. She did not mention Fitzgerald by name, nor did she suggest infidelity. Yet the emotional tone of her writing hinted at deeper undercurrents, challenges born not from disloyalty, perhaps, but from distance. Unlike the more explosive political scandals that marked other administrations, the Bush-Fitzgerald story never broke into public consciousness in a significant way. There was no investigation, no confirmation, no fallout. The story, such as it was, faded into the background, kept alive only through unofficial accounts, whispered recollections, and the occasional revival in unauthorized biographies. Some defenders of Bush argue that the rumors are the product of cynicism, retroactive speculation applied to a man whose public image was defined by dignity. They point to the lack of hard evidence, the consistent denials, and the professional nature of Fitzgerald's roles. Others see the persistent nature of the claims, the unusual closeness, and the unwillingness to address the topic directly as suggestive of a different truth, one more personal, more private, and carefully maintained. In either case, what the story reveals is less about proof and more about perception. The late 20th century marked a turning point in how presidential lives were examined. The post-Watergate media landscape was more aggressive, more willing to cross personal boundaries in search of political truths. And yet, Bush's presidency, though recent, still existed within a transitional moment, not quite fully exposed, but no longer fully protected. The Fitzgerald affair, if it occurred, was not one of scandal in the traditional sense. There were no dramatic revelations, no legal consequences, no televised confessions. It was a story of proximity and silence, of intimacy managed under the cover of official duty. If it was real, it was invisible by design. If it wasn't, it remains a powerful example of how narratives can form and persist in the absence of certainty. What complicates the story further is its placement within a legacy otherwise defined by quiet competence and restraint. Bush was not a figure of drama. His presidency was marked by diplomatic achievements, the end of the Cold War, the Gulf War coalition, the quiet navigation of a changing global order. He was, by his own admission, a man uncomfortable with grandstanding and uninterested in spectacle. And yet, the whispers remain. They do not demand resolution so much as recognition that even the most orderly legacies contain shadows, that public virtue and private complexity are not mutually exclusive, and that history, especially the history of power, is shaped as much by what is left unsaid as by what is proclaimed. Bush never addressed the rumors in interviews, nor did his memoirs offer insight into his personal relationships beyond his family. Fitzgerald vanished from public view after his presidency, remaining as silent in retirement as she had been in office. There was no reckoning, no closure, only the persistent sense of a story incomplete. As the new century dawned and presidential life entered the digital age, the nature of secrecy would change again. The press would become relentless, privacy would shrink, and candidates would find themselves navigating not just policy and public approval, but personal history brought forward with speed and certainty. Because the next chapter would arrive not in suggestion or rumor, but in headlines, lawsuits, and payoff agreements. The affair would not be hidden in quiet devotion, but negotiated in contracts and silence bought with money. It would be a story not of whispered names, but of courtroom drama and campaign fallout. And this time, everyone would know. Donald Trump. By the time Donald J. Trump entered the Oval Office in January 2017, he had already spent decades in the public eye on television, in tabloid headlines, in lawsuits, and in real estate skyscrapers that bore his name in gold. Unlike many presidents before him, Trump did not arrive wrapped in the illusion of private virtue or tightly managed image. He arrived with his controversies well documented, his personal life dissected in front of audiences for nearly half a century. His was not a story of affairs hidden behind veils of discretion. His story was about what it meant when the veils were torn off and the world kept watching anyway. Among the many women linked to Trump over the years, two names would eventually become central to the discussion of hidden affairs during or just before his presidency: Karen McDougal and Stormy Daniels. Stormy Daniels, born Stephanie Clifford, is an adult film actress and director. Her alleged affair with Trump reportedly took place in 2006, just months after the birth of Trump's youngest son with his third wife, Melania. Daniels has described the encounter in various interviews and in her 2018 book Full Disclosure, claiming that the relationship was brief but consensual. What elevated the story beyond gossip and international headlines was not the affair itself, but what followed. In 2016, just weeks before the presidential election, Daniels was paid $130,000 in a non-disclosure agreement arranged by Trump's personal lawyer at the time, Michael Cohen. The goal was clear: silence. Daniels was preparing to go public, and the payment, categorized as a hush money settlement, was intended to prevent that. The agreement, however, became a flashpoint when it was revealed in early 2018, leading to a series of legal challenges, congressional inquiries, and criminal investigations. Trump initially denied knowing about the payment, but months later, Rudy Giuliani, one of his legal representatives, stated that Trump had reimbursed Cohen. The statements shifted, then blurred, and then hardened into an official defense strategy. The case eventually led to Michael Cohen's conviction for campaign finance violations, with the payment deemed an illegal contribution meant to influence the outcome of the election by suppressing damaging information. Karen McDougal's story followed a parallel track. A former Playboy model, McDougal alleged that she had a year-long affair with Trump beginning in 2006. Her story was purchased by American Media Inc., AMI, the publisher of the National Enquirer, in a deal that promised her $150,000 for the exclusive rights to her account. But once AMI had the story, They never published it, a practice known as catch and kill. McDougal later said she felt misled and silenced. Like the Daniels case, McDougal's experience became a matter of legal scrutiny. AMI ultimately admitted to coordinating with the Trump campaign to suppress negative information during the election and entered into a non-prosecution agreement with federal investigators. The admission was unprecedented. It marked one of the few instances in which a media company acknowledged deliberately hiding a story in coordination with a political candidate. These weren't just stories of personal indiscretion. They became part of the broader legal and ethical investigations that surrounded Trump's presidency. The Daniels and McDougal arrangements fed into wider questions about campaign finance, truthfulness, and the boundaries of executive power. And yet, in the face of mounting evidence and testimony, the consequences, at least politically, were limited. Trump's political base, already accustomed to unconventional behavior, did not abandon him. His approval ratings fluctuated, but he remained a dominant force in American politics through the end of his term and beyond. The stories, though damning in traditional political terms, became absorbed into the larger narrative of a presidency defined by disruption. They didn't disappear, they were simply outpaced by the next scandal, and the next. Throughout it all, Trump continued to deny the affairs. He dismissed Daniels and McDougal's accounts as false or exaggerated. He characterized the legal payments as standard non-disclosure agreements common among public figures. The press, divided along partisan lines, either amplified the controversy or minimized it. What might have shattered previous administrations became, in this case, just one more episode in a presidency built on confrontation with norms. What makes Trump's affairs different from those of earlier presidents is not just the explicit nature of the accusations or the involvement of money in legal contracts, but the context in which they occurred. These were not secrets managed by discreet aides or hidden in personal letters. They were managed through legal threats, shell corporations, and coordinated media strategies. They were not private indiscretions, but public negotiations, conducted in full view of a divided nation. Melania Trump, like many first ladies before her, remained mostly silent. She did not address the allegations directly, though she was noticeably absent from public events during peak periods of scandal. In interviews, she insisted she had more important things to focus on than gossip. Her silence, like that of her predecessors, was both personal and political, an act of self-preservation in a world that rarely extends empathy to women in her position. The Daniels and McDougal stories also marked a shift in the way power and consent were discussed in the public sphere. Daniels, in particular, reclaimed her narrative through media appearances, interviews, and her memoir. She refused to be shamed or silenced, challenging the assumption that women who speak out against powerful men must do so only through tears or trauma. Her tone was assertive, her purpose clear, to tell her story on her own terms. In the end, the legal cases did not end Trump's political career. He was not removed from office, nor did the revelations prompt mass resignations or retractions. But they did redefine the boundaries of presidential privacy. They demonstrated that even the most sensitive stories, those involving sex, money, and secrecy, could be litigated in public and still fail to generate lasting political damage. The equation between scandal and consequence had shifted. And yet, the affair stories surrounding Donald Trump are part of a much older lineage. They echo the same themes: power leveraged in private, secrets maintained through systems, the thin line between intimacy and influence. The difference is that in Trump's case, the old tools of concealment, denial, silence, distance were replaced with contracts, threats, and media control. What remains, as with all the stories before it, is not just the question of what happened, but the reflection of how the story was handled, who was believed, and what it says about the presidency itself. Because even in an era of endless exposure, some stories still end in ambiguity. And as the modern presidency continues to unfold, it does so with the knowledge that secrets are never fully buried, only delayed. Just long enough, perhaps, for history to catch up.